Rob, thank you so much for joining 24 Hours of Reality. Full disclosure to our audience, Rob GLASER and I have been personal friends for many years, and we work together in networks and communications, internet-based communications. But I have known of your interest, Rob, in the climate crisis for a long time. And just for starters, I'm not sure I know how you first got interested in the climate crisis. What tipped you over the edge to become a climate activist?
Well, Al, it's great to see you and great to be in touch with your audience around the world. Today is an incredibly important event. I'd say my interest goes back many years, but a crowning moment was about 25 years ago when I read this book called Earth in the Balance. I think you might have heard of it. And it pulled together many things. By happy coincidence, you and I first met about 6 months later. I remember talking to you about many of the issues you raised in that book. And that was a huge step forward for me. The only thing I would say beyond that was when my twins were born 12 years ago. And I really thought about, well, the world that we have today is obviously in climate crisis, but when I extrapolate forward, when they're my age, which will be in the 2060s, 2063, I think, to be precise, what's the climate going to be like then, 45 years from now? And I think back, you and I first talked about this 25 years ago. So in that 70-year span that we're a little more than a third of the way through, there's going to be so many things happening, and the actions and the things we do now have a huge impact on their lives and their children's lives. So it's a personal imperative as well as a societal imperative.
Well, it's certainly one of the truths of the human condition that men, when they become fathers, are often transformed by that experience and their outlook on the future. And you have become a real expert on the exact topic that we are focused on in this 24 Hours of Reality, the intersection of the climate crisis and the global health crisis. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to be sure to ask you to participate. And your GLASER Progress Foundation is exploring initiatives to combat the health threats connected to the climate crisis. And I want to hear about them. Can you detail these initiatives, and how do you keep the climate crisis from seeming like an abstract concept to some people?
Well, Al, that's exactly it. So going back to our family foundation work about 15, 18 years ago, we got very involved in the global AIDS crisis, and we're able to do a lot of work working with the Global Fund around AIDS, TB, and malaria to help catalyze a lot of the work that led to a huge change, literally improving the lives of tens of millions of people around the world, primarily but not only in sub-Saharan Africa, by using science to change the course of history. And what I observed there is that part of why that worked is that public health became a nonpartisan issue around the world, where you had people who considered themselves conservative, liberal, moderate, whatever their political persuasions, they all understood that this was a public health crisis. So about 2.5, 3 years ago, we started exploring how do we make sure that society understands that the climate crisis is a public health crisis and probably will end up being the single most profound public health crisis that we as a society have ever faced. So we've been taking small steps along the way, and you and your work in Climate Reality and many other organizations have been incredibly important partners in that, to start to connect the dots, to get society to understand that it's not a coincidence that millions of people, 7, 8, 9 million people a year now, are dying from pollution. And that impact, that pollution in many cases, is directly caused by the same polluting work that is causing the climate crisis. And so in my mind, if we can connect the dots for people that the climate crisis isn't just an abstract thing, but that is affecting human lives today, I think we have a much better shot at causing action to be taken more actively, more energetically, and more urgently.
Well said. And to focus in specifically on air pollution, some of what you're referring to, air pollution, especially in major cities, is a key factor in the climate crisis. As you point out, when you burn fossil fuels, you create global warming pollution, and at the same time, you create the kind of air pollution that kills people with lung diseases and other maladies. What can urban communities do to mobilize effectively in an effort to tackle both air pollution and the climate crisis?
Well, as you say, there is a deep connection, and of course, here on the West Coast, you're in Los Angeles, I'm in Seattle. We've seen some of the worst fires in our civilization's history over the last 2 or 3 years. My mother was living in a town called Santa Rosa, California, that had a horrible fire just a year ago. She was evacuated at 4 in the morning, at 90 at the time, a 91-year-old woman. So this is a very personal thing on the other end of my familial spectrum. And of course, well, that was she's now just passed, as you know.
Oh,
and,
I'm sorry, I forgot.
She
Rob,
was somebody who cared deeply.
But it was only a year ago that she was evacuated.
Well, you sent me a kind note, Al, so I know that.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, and honestly, I don't know. It's hard to know the impact that it had on her life. Yeah. She lived a good, long life, but I know that many people in her community were deeply affected by the pollution, and we're seeing that now. So, what people can do, which is the question you asked. Well, first off, we can be citizen activists. We can vote on policy matters. We can make sure that we're engaging civically to change the way our society values pollution versus other more productive and healthier forms of economic activity. So that's first and foremost. We can be citizen activists. Other things we can do is, we can actually use our media to tell the story. I'm an internet guy, as you know, and I think of you're and my mutual friends, acquaintances like Mark Zuckerberg and Larry Page. Imagine that if they had Climate Wednesday on Facebook or Climate Tuesday on Google, where instead of getting a Google Doodle or whatever, you actually got a couple key facts on the climate, where you would see in this medium that is a very vibrant medium, ways that you can do positive impact, not politically left, not right, not conservative, not liberal, not about tax policy, but literally about things that we can do to make the planet healthier. So there's many, many things as technologists we can do, as citizens we can do to bend the curve on CO2 emissions, to bend the curve on policy, so that we end up with a healthier planet for ourselves, for our children, and for our grandchildren.
Well, first, my condolences once again on the loss of your mom, and I do remember our communications, and I'm sorry I momentarily forgot about that. I was focused on, I show slides of Santa Rosa and all.
You got a lot on your mind, Al. I understand
there.
This is 20.
But,
yeah, exactly.
I love your ideas on how social media could be more proactive in increasing awareness and distributing ideas about the solutions. But in a more general way, businesses and industry have made some progress in recent years in reducing emissions. Many of them have, and becoming more sustainable. What trends have you noticed on this front, and how could we accelerate the positive change, because there's so much work that still needs to be done?
Well, I've driven an electric car for over 4 years as my primary method of transportation. So moving our terrestrial transportation to be entirely electric, to rid it from the fossil fuel dependency cycle, is a very straightforward thing to do. We know how to do it thanks to pioneering work from the likes of Elon Musk. It's now only a matter of time when all cars are going to move from being based on fossil fuels to being based on electricity, which can be generated in many much more renewable, sustainable, cleaner ways. So that's a very concrete example of how you change transportation to get transportation out of the unhealthy carbon cycle. There are other things that many other industries can do. I happen to work in industries that are not heavy industries, so our technologies aren't inherently polluting. But literally, whatever job you're in, whatever industry you're in, you can make a difference. And I think the positive message that this event tries to focus on, which is there are solutions that can bend the curve and make a difference, is important for everybody to understand. Not everybody can build a new electric car. Only a few companies make cars, and only a few entrepreneurs start car companies. But everyone can choose what kind of car they choose to drive and have an impact. So there's all choices we make as consumers, as well as in our work lives, can have a huge impact when you accumulate them together.
I love that you're focused on this, Rob. You have such a keen mind, and I've enjoyed working with you. I wish we had more time for this conversation. We're about out of time, but I have one more question if you can answer it briefly, and it really is a question that calls for a long answer. We've talked about the role of media in its impact on democracy. And in order to solve the climate crisis, we've got to address the democracy crisis. Sorry for asking you to answer this briefly, because I know it's an in-depth question that you've thought about. But what can internet-based media do to not hurt democracy, but help to bring democracy back to life?
I would say transparency is the #1 word. If people understood where the messages that they were hearing coming from, you know, the amount of money that the Koch brothers are putting into, supporting extractive industries at the expense of the climate, the amount of money that's being put into politicians to take anti-climate positions. If we just made all that more transparent, I think it would have a huge impact on changing the discourse. So that's a short answer to a very important question that I know you've thought about deeply as well.
Rob Glaser, thank you so much for the work you're doing, for your leadership, for your vision, and thank you for being a part of 24 Hours of Reality.